Greetings all, Ferrari Man 601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18th scale model car review of this by Mattel Hot Wheels, the Ferrari F2005 as driven by Michael Schumacher in the 2005 Formula One season. The F2005, it will not go down in history, and it has not gone down in history as one of the more successful Ferrari Formula One cars. In fact, it's probably remembered as one of the more infamous ones, in that it was the car that lost Ferrari the Drivers' and Constructors' World Championships after utter dominance, going all the way back to 1999 with their Constructors' Championship win, and of course, the 5 straight Drivers' Championship wins for Michael Schumacher. It had to come to an end at some point, and, well, the F2005 presided over the loss of the World Championship crowns for Ferrari and for Michael Schumacher. After his final Drivers' Championship triumph in 2004, 2005 saw a raft of regulation changes which ultimately saw the end of Ferrari's dominance. They were supplanted by McLaren and Renault in being the frontrunners for 2005, with Renault and Fernando Alonso coming out as the victors in both the Constructors' and Drivers' World Championships. But the F2005, it is the last V10-powered Ferrari Formula One car, and of course, who doesn't love a V10? I certainly love a hashtag V10 forever, and, well, that's why we're taking another look at this model. We have taken a look at this one before on the channel, but now we've got a tripod and a little bit better way of doing these reviews, so we are going to take another look at the F2005 here in 1/18th scale by Mattel. Let's have a look. The Ferrari F2005. This is not one of the cars that people generally think about when they think of the dominance that Ferrari had in the early part of the 2000s, but this is the last V10 Ferrari Formula One car. Was it the most prestigious? No, absolutely it was not. In fact, you can make an argument that this is the car that lost everything for Ferrari. After winning the Constructors' Championship every year running since 1999, the F2005 had the dubious honor of presiding over Ferrari's loss of the Constructors' and the Drivers' titles to Renault and to Fernando Alonso respectively. Why did this happen? Well, 2005 was far from a straightforward year in terms of a regulatory environment. The formula had remained basically stable since the year 2000. Probably the biggest innovation or the biggest bit of liberalism in the regulations was allowing traction control once again. Traction control had formerly been banned since the end of 1993. However, the teams by this point had figured out workarounds on how to get traction control or to emulate a traction control effect through their engine management, through their brake systems, and things of that nature. So for 2001 at the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola, the FIA said, all right, we know you're doing it anyway, you can now legally run traction control. But other than that, that was basically it in terms of technical innovations in terms of the regulatory environment. Everything else remained pretty stable. The cars all had the same overall dimensions going all the way back from 1998. They had the groove tires as well from 1998. So by the time we get to 2004, things very much had settled into a pecking order, and Ferrari was at the top of that pecking order. 2005, to shake things up, the FIA tried one of the most interesting things that they had done to date in terms of the technical regulations, the tires. You cannot change your tires during the Grand Prix. In fact, you cannot change your tires after qualifying begins. So what does this mean? It means that the two tire constructors of this era, Michelin and Bridgestone, they suddenly had to come up with compounds and constructions that could last an entire race distance, plus a couple of timed hot laps during qualifying. Qualifying in this era was not the Q1, Q2, Q3 knockout format that we see today. Rather, it was just a set of 2 timed hot laps with the cars on track by themselves. For 2005, at least in the beginning of the season, these sessions were held on 2 separate days. You had a Friday qualifying and a Saturday qualifying, and the 2 lap times set by each driver would be aggregated, and from those aggregate times, the grid would be formed. Generally what would happen is the cars would run on different fuel loads, so you'd have a heavy fuel lap and then you'd have a light fuel lap, and then you'd add those times together. Basically, it was meant to get the cars in relative order of what the race pace could be expected to be. However, what that really yielded was just a field that was going to string itself out all by itself. In other words, had you started the race, that's the order that the cars would just naturally fall into. So it did not really help in terms of the spectacle, although I did personally find it rather interesting to see each car in isolation out on track. You could see what each car was good at and what it wasn't good at, and you could definitely see the differences in driving style amongst all the drivers on the grid. So that was an interesting thing. Unfortunately, we've not seen anything like that since the 2005 season. However, for Ferrari, what this meant was a complete shakeup of their general modus operandi, which meant that, hey, you've definitely lost your mojo. Bridgestone in particular, Ferrari's tire supplier, had a big problem adapting to this new requirement of having to run for the entire Grand Prix distance, which meant that, well, Michelin, they had the upper hand, and Michelin were supplying Ferrari's chief rivals Renault and McLaren. With the exception of the 2005 United States Grand Prix, where no Michelin runners took the start on safety grounds, yeah, Michelin was definitely the tire to be on, and either the McLaren or the Renault was the car to be in if you were trying to win the Drivers' Championship. This meant overall, though, that the F2005 finished third overall in the Constructors' Championship, as did its number one driver, Michael Schumacher. In terms of the overall history and construction of the car, though, what is the F2005? Well, it is the Formula One car with which Ferrari competed in the 2005 Formula One World Championship. Its immediate predecessor was the F2004 of 2004, and was succeeded in 2006 by the 248 F1. That car named because of the new engine formula, a 2.4-liter V8. Therefore, this is the last Ferrari Formula One car with the 3-liter V10 engine, and, well, yes, we like V10s for sure. In principle, the car was designed by Ferrari's technical chiefs Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne. Ross Brawn being the technical director of the era, and Rory Byrne was credited with being the chief designer. However, you also had a few other players behind the scenes. You had Aldo Costa, who was the head of the chassis design. You had John Illy, who was the head of Aerodynamics, and you had Marco De Luca, who was the chief aerodynamicist. So, interesting little subordinate superior relationship there. Ferrari's organizational structure has always been a bit of a mess. Technically speaking, what have we got? Well, we have got ourselves mid-2000s Formula One, so we have carbon fiber galore. Everywhere you look, there is probably carbon fiber underneath that stereotypical red paint. It's a carbon fiber and epoxy honeycomb composite monocoque for the main structure of the car, where the cockpit is, and everything bolts into that monocoque, of course. Our suspension, we have got push rod suspension front and rear on this car. We've got push rods running from the wheel hubs there into bell cranks and torsion bars, and of course spring dampers as well going into the monocoque there. All of that is basically the same on the rear, although the dampers are going to be mounted to the gearbox casing on the rear rather than into their own little bulkhead onto the front of the monocoque there behind the nose structure. Overall length on the car is 4,545 millimeters or 179 inches. The width is 1,796 millimeters or 71 inches. The height is 959 millimeters or 38 inches. The axle track, that's the width between the wheels on the front and rear axles. On the front, it's 1,470 millimeters or 58 inches, and on the rear, it's slightly narrower actually, 1,405 millimeters or 55 inches. Overall wheelbase, that's the length between the center lines of the front and rear axles, longitudinally, 3,050 millimeters or 120 inches. The engine, as we mentioned, it is a V10. It is the Ferrari Tipo 055. It's a 3-liter V10. 3 liters is 183 cubic inches in American money. It's a V10 at 90 degrees, naturally aspirated, and of course it is mounted in the middle of the car behind the fuel tank and the cockpit. The transmission in this car, 7-speed plus reverse semi-automatic paddle shift unit. And, of course, we have got a differential in the back as well, only power being sent to the rear axle on these Formula One cars, so that differential there right behind the gearbox and your suspension components, and, of course, your engine mounted directly to that gearbox and gearbox casing. So the engine and the gearbox, they make the structural spine of the rear section of the car, and, of course, all of that going through the monocoque there, mounting bolts into the monocoque around the fuel tank. So the whole car is just held together down the middle from the monocoque, the engine, and the gearbox, and everything mounted to those components. So the engine being a stressed member in these Formula One cars, and they remain so to this day. Again, that design language goes all the way back to the mid-1960s there with cars like the Lotus Type 25 and Type 49. Brilliant. Overall power figures being produced by this car, a little bit murky to try and come across these figures even today because, of course, overall engine output was a closely guarded secret in the era, and considering these cars don't race anymore, there's not really much of a reason to be looking for these numbers, but we're going to say about 930 to 950 horsepower, although by the end of 2005 it was very popularly rumored that these cars were producing over 1,000 horsepower, at least in qualifying trim, so you can sort of use your mind's eye and your best judgment there. Overall weight was 1,334 pounds, or 605 kilograms formula weight. That is including the driver. The fuel and lubricants, as you will see in the sponsors there in the side pods, provided by Shell, and the tires were, as we mentioned, Bridgestone Potenzas. Overall competition history, though, the car was only entered by Ferrari in 2005, and it was driven by Michael Schumacher, who we see here, and Rubens Barrichello in the number 2 car. The car made its debut at the 2005 Bahrain Grand Prix, which actually was not the first round of 2005. For the first 2 rounds of the season, the Ferrari team actually ran the F2004 in a modified specification known as the F2004M. By round 3, Bahrain, the F2005 was ready. After the 17 races in which this car competed, it took 1 victory, a further 8 podium finishes, 1 pole position, and 3 fastest laps. This meant that the car did not win the Drivers' or Constructors' Championship, and the car's only victory was a hollow one at the U.S. Grand Prix at Indianapolis after only 6 cars took the start because all the Michelin runners withdrew. With the car rotating once again, let's get a lay of the land here and get a little bit of a closer look at some of the details on this model here. It's 1/18 scale by Mattel, and it was produced in period. So this is a 2005 or a very early 2006 model of a 2005 car. So it's representative of the sorts of techniques and tooling that Mattel were using in this era. And, well, it's not quite in the same league as something like a Mini Champs, and of course it's in an entirely different universe compared to something like a CMC, Auto Art, or Exato even. But what we do have here is actually pretty good. The Mattel models of this era, particularly the Formula One cars, they were very inconsistent, I would say. I've got several Mattel Formula One models in the collection, and some are definitely better than others. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the year that they're produced. It doesn't really seem like age is much of a factor in these. Rather, it seems like it was just an investment decision that they made at the time. Which cars were they going to do up a little bit more nicely, and which ones were they going to let slide a little bit? For example, the 248 F1, this car's immediate successor, and we've taken a look at that twice over on the channel. Well, that one, yes, it's macrocosmically similar, and of course it's very similar overall to this car, being only 1 year removed from it, but quality-wise, in terms of fit and finish, assembly, just not quite as good as this one. This one, though, definitely it is in the upper echelon of Mattel quality, I must say. Things fit nicely, nothing is just loose on this car, and even though it's already quite old by this point, it still looks good, and it still holds up after all these years. So, I've got to say, good job here overall by Mattel. But the overall configuration of this thing, what do we have? Well, obviously, you've seen we've got pretty big front and rear wings on this car, as you'd expect. We've got big barge boards there in the midsection of the front end of the car, just below the Ferrari Scudetto Shield logo there. But have a look at this front wing. You can see we do have generally a spoon profile wing, as we saw in this era, but that gantry wing underneath the nose tip there. What is going on there? Well, for 2005, part of the regulation changes. Yes, we talked about the tires having to last for an entire Grand Prix distance, but what else changed? Well, they wanted to take away some downforce from these cars, much like we would see much later on in 2013 with banning the exhaust blown diffusers, at least the off-throttle exhaust blowing, and then really in 2014 with the beginning of the turbo hybrid era, and they cut a lot of downforce from those cars there, namely with the front and rear wings and diffusers. But for 2005, they decided to revise the placement of the front and rear wings a little bit. You can see this front wing here. It's a bit high off the ground when you take a look at the end plates, and that is entirely intentional. In 2004, the front wings were lower, and the lower you can get a wing to the ground, the more efficient it's going to be at generating whatever force it's trying to generate. In this case, it's trying to generate downforce or negative lift. When you raise the overall height of the wing, you basically increase the space that air has to travel. And when you constrict air, when you pass a flow through a constriction, its pressure is going to rise, relatively speaking. Its speed is also going to rise, relatively speaking. And the way an aircraft wing works, it's using a speed differential relative to the lower and upper surfaces of the wing. And the faster moving air moving over top of an aircraft wing generates a lower relative pressure on the adjacent surface, which means that you create a suction, relatively speaking, on the upper surface of the wing, which then pulls an aircraft wing upward and generates lift. A race car wing is working in exactly the same way, but flipped over in the opposite direction. So you're trying to create that negative lift on the lower surface of the wing, which then transmits a net download, a downforce into the rest of the car and helps keep it on the road. What you do, though, by raising the wing, you remove efficiency in that process, which means generally you're going to produce less downforce. Similarly speaking, the rear wings, they weren't revised all that much for 2005, but their placement was. They had to move forward a little bit relative to the 2004 and prior wings, which then means that, well, the center of pressure on the car is now going to move forward and make things a little bit less stable at the rear. So you're going to remove all-out cornering speed in that regard. When you couple those changes with the much harder and much more robust tires that you had in this era, the lap times relative to 2004 dropped significantly. However, there was a loophole in the front wing regulations, and you'll notice that gantry wing on the front end of the F2005. Why is that there? Well, in their infinite wisdom, the rules makers, they neglected to say that the front wing needed to be a uniform height across its entire latitudinal axis. So that means that the teams came up with two primary approaches. One, you had the spoon profile wing, which means that the center section of the wing dips down along the wing mainplane profile, and the center section of the wing therefore is closer to the ground and can generate more downforce in that way. However, Ferrari, they were a little bit behind the curve, perhaps some pun intended there, on this overall trend. They understood that you didn't have to have the front wing be a uniform height across its entire latitudinal axis, but they did not quite put two and two together and say, let's make a spoon profile. Rather, they added this ancillary gantry wing there, just below the nose tip, and you can see it's got two main planes all of its own between those two smaller end fences. Well, that is what Ferrari did. Same overall macrocosmic rationale as the spoon profile wing, but a different approach to make it happen. Was it as effective as the spoon profile? Probably not quite. But Ferrari did run this wing for the balance of 2005, which means that it must have worked, but perhaps it just wasn't quite as efficient. For 2006, though, Ferrari did fully adopt the spoon profile front wing, and they got rid of that gantry system. And in 2006, they even started to play with upper bridge elements on the front wing. These were two strakes coming out from the nose cone proper and then linking up with the end fences coming down at an angle outboard to the car. So yes, it's a little bit of an interesting wing solution and very unique. I don't recall any other cars running anything like that, basically in any era. We've seen other appendages sprout from the front wing, both before and after 2005, but this solution was very unique, and it was something that we only saw on the F2005 in the era, so very cool. Otherwise, moving away from the front wing, things look a whole lot more conventional across the rest of the car. You can see we've got our front suspension components there and our front wheels and barge boards in the midsection of the front end of the monocoque. You can see we've got three principal barge board elements. We have got the large barge boards, the primary barge boards that I tend to call them there, and they are in white and red, the red stripe there across the lower fourth or so of the barge board. But ahead of them, you have also got two more sets of barge boards. You can see that we have got a lower set just below the center line of the front end of the monocoque, right under where the front nose assembly connects with the rest of the car. And then just arrears of that, you've got another set of barge boards there, which then interface with the primary barge boards and the leading edge of the floor there in the tongue T-tray section. So I like all of that, and that looks very well and good. And of course, the rationale of all of that is to get the airflow managed around the front tires, or rather inboard of the front tires and underneath the front suspension, so you can start to feed the floor and, more importantly, seal the outer edges of the reference plane there. That's the very edge of the floor under the side pods. And if you can seal that reference plane area, it means that you can get more efficiency out of your diffuser. And of course, the whole bottom under tray of the car is effectively a diffuser, but we're really concerned with the back section of that floor, because that is where you've got all of these strakes, as you can see here. They are going to manage the airflow up and out of the rear end of the car and create more negative pressure underneath the rear zone to try and claw back some of the downforce that they've lost due to the placement of the rear wing being slightly forward a bit relative to 2004. So really, that front wing is the most distinctive and interesting area of design, aerodynamically speaking, here on the F2005. Otherwise, at the rear end, you can see we've got periscope-style exhausts, venting topside. All of that is par for the course. Ferrari innovated that little solution back in 1998 for the Spanish Grand Prix, I believe that was. And then, of course, the rear wing proper. But just forward of the rear wing, you've also got a little T-wing there. It's in black, so it might be a little bit difficult to see. But right at the edge of the trailing edge of the engine cover there, you can see that black beam wing area. That is the T-wing. Just forward of the rear wing, and effectively has the same overall rationale as the T-wings that we saw in 2017 before Twitter decided that they were ugly, so the FIA banned them for no reason. But just a little bit lower and a little bit further forward than what we saw in 2017. And really the same overall rationale. We're trying to condition the flow as it comes across the top side of the engine cover and funnel it through the gap underneath the rear wing to try and get a little bit more negative pressure in that underside of the rear wing for more downforce generation. Very, very nice. You can see chimneys here. These are different from what we see today. We don't really see chimneys today, but these chimneys are basically exhaust stacks for the radiators. Of course, all of that high pressure but hot air, as it's been used by the radiators to try and cool the car, that's got to go somewhere. Some of it would have been routed rearwards at the back of the engine cover to try and blow the rear wing area, but a lot of it was just vented out the top immediately after it was used, and of course trying to influence that flow beyond its exit with these little flick-up winglets just behind those chimneys. And they, of course, are also trying to generate a little bit more downforce as well as steer the air toward the upper surface of the rear wing just to help energize that flow a little bit farther. So they're always trying to work with the air and trying to work with air that's already been manipulated just to control it throughout the car's entire travel through it, because if you can mitigate turbulence and mitigate any excess flow, you're going to gain more performance. You're going to generate less drag, and you're also going to use the air in a little bit more of a utilitarian sense, not just to get your car through it, but to use it to make your car faster. Finally, in the rear zone, you can see these little flick-ups just ahead of the rear wheels, and again, they are trying to mitigate outwash there and turbulence from the rear wheels. Wheels going through an airstream, they really are very bad aerodynamically. They generate a lot of drag because you've got this large cross-sectional area presented to the onrushing airstream, but they're also spinning, so they're generating their own forces aerodynamically, so a lot of turbulence coming off of both the front and rear wheels on a Formula One car of all eras. And again, just trying to mitigate some of that as much as possible to cut down on drag, which means more straight line speed and cleaner flow to the rest of the aerodynamic appendages on the car, so you can get more downforce at the same time as trying to mitigate your drag effects. Very nice indeed. Stopping the rotation and starting to take a closer look at some of the smaller details on the model. There is the front wing that we belabored the point on earlier, and well, as you can see, not too bad here from mid-2000s Mattel. Probably the most glaring thing about this is those shut lines there between the main plane flap elements. They are just black paint there. They are not separate elements on the main plane. Just judging here by eye, looks like we should have 1, 2, 3 elements there on the main plane, but it is just cast in one single plastic piece with the black stripes there painted in there to try and emulate the look of separate slot gaps there, but they are just one element. Below there, though, on the gantry wing, we do actually have 2 main planes there, so that's all well and good. I quite like that. So they definitely put some effort into that, but on the main plane proper, not so much. But there is nice geometry nonetheless of all the flap surfaces, as well as on the end fences. You can see here just ahead of the right wheel here, screen left for us. You can see that we have got these 2 elements of the end fence in addition to the vortex generator surface underneath. And of course, all of that is nicely reiterated there on the left side of the car, screen right for us. Very cool. The nose tip and overall nose geometry looks very convincing, and all of the decals there are mounted nicely and straight, so that's all well and good. I did like the overall geometries of the front noses and the overall front wing presence on these cars in this era. It just all looked very, very nice, and I don't know, they looked like Formula One cars in this era. Nowadays, I've gotten used to them, but they don't quite have the same appeal to me. Across the top of the nose and over toward the monocoque, you can see the very nice finish on the paint on this car. That looks very, very nice. Still very reflective, and it's in good shape even after all these years, so I do like all of that. Additionally, front and center, you can see that we have got the pitot tubes and antennas here, giving telemetry back to the pits and also feeding a little bit of information to the driver as well, I do believe. Very, very nice. You can also just start to see the shut line of the nose assembly where it attaches to the monocoque in this area. Very nice. Moving back forward and down a little bit, there is our front suspension. Double wishbone push rod arrangement, as you can see there. Very nice details, I must say. I do like all of that. On both sides, the suspension is straight. Nothing is bent or crooked or anything like that. Just looks very, very nice. I do like all of that. And then, of course, your tire tread surface there with the grooves cut into them for the regulations there. Groove tires, again, they came in 1998. The rationale of that at that time was to try and reduce cornering speeds, and the groove tires definitely did go a long way in doing that. Less rubber on the ground means less overall grip, which means that you've got to slow down to make it around the corners. Before 1998, with Formula One running slick tires, well, cornering speeds started to get a little bit too high for some of the rules makers' comfort, so they decided to knock them down just a touch, and that's what happened there, and the groove tires remained all the way up until the 2009 season. Rearward on the car again, starting to take a look into the midsection. Radiator inlets there. There is an attempt at a radiator matrix there. A little bit of a grid there visible on both sides. Here on the right side of the car, a little bit nicer in terms of how the light's falling into it. There is an attempt of a matrix arrangement in there, and it all looks very, very nice. And additionally, you can see the wing mirrors on the car. The wing mirrors on the F2005, they did go through several different iterations. They tried an arrangement where they put the wing mirrors actually on the outboard sides of the front end of the side pods, and that was something that the FIA initially took a little bit of a dim view of, but then allowed Ferrari to do it, and they did that in 2006 on the 248 F1. But also here on the F2005, you saw it on Schumacher's car in particular. He ran two mirrors of differing heights, so you have a longer stalk on one mirror versus the other. And what this probably was for was so that Schumacher could take a look at his rear tires a little bit better, because Ferrari really struggled with tire wear and tire integrity, particularly early in the season. And Schumacher, just being the sort of data-driven analyzer that he was, he wanted to have as much information as possible visible to him, rather than trying to rely on the pits to tell him what's going on. He wanted to see it for himself, and that was one of the ways that he did it. Very interestingly, per the regulations in this era, even though they were not allowed to change tires during the Grand Prix, neither were they allowed to finish the race without any tread surface visible. So in other words, if there were no grooves visible on the tire at the end of the Grand Prix, they could be thrown out of the event. So not only did you have to have the tires work well enough, given how hard they were, you couldn't have them work too well and effectively become a slick after you wore the grooves down. That was not allowed. So yeah, just little bits of adaptations and accommodations required there for Schumacher anyway, to keep a handle on his rear tire wear, just to make sure that they're doing what they should do. Very interesting. Taking a look from the right side of F2005, there we go with our front wing end fence here. Now seen from the side, and you can just see the general disposition of everything. We do have this little streak here on the end fence, which of course right here it's red on red, so maybe a little bit difficult to see contrast-wise, but there it is. And of course the Vodafone branding there across the flat face of the end fence, and then we have this little lip section underneath. So that's all well and good. I do like all of that. Very good. And it's just flat underneath here. So this section here to generate a little bit of a vortex, which is then going to try and get inwash inside the front axle there to start things interfacing with the barge boards, as we can see right here. So here we go, lower elements of barge boards ahead of the upper principal primary barge boards, and then of course we've got some vortex generators here, little striations in the lower face of the primary barge boards before they start to interface with the floor proper, the reference plane right there. Very cool. You can see the overall geometries of the side pods starting to get a little bit more sculpted here. Before 2005, really going back to the late 90s and the year 2000, 2001, you had the side pod radiator inlets right here, but they were very squared off. Now they're starting to sculpt this area a little bit more to create a little bit of a vortex tunnel to start feeding the diffuser as we start to get to the back of the car. So interesting to see there. And of course, the side pod shape itself, all sculpted. This moves inboard very nicely to start to get that air feeding the upper level of the diffuser. The more air you can get in there, the more energized you can make that central flow. So very interesting. I do like all of that. Very cool to see. Moving back top side, you can see just generally here what the air is doing after it passes over the nose. Things are basically straight and level up to the cockpit area. And in the cockpit area, you can see here the cockpit surround. Yes, it's there, just like it is nowadays, but it's nowhere near as high as it is today. And those cockpit bolsters, the removable padding that is around the rim of the cockpit there to give the driver's head something to run into that's soft and deformable in the event of a lateral impact. That was raised for the 2008 season, and the height of that has been pretty much fixed since 2008. Of course, nowadays with the cockpit, all of that being supplemented by the halo system and giving the driver a whole lot more head protection than they had in this era. But still very much the same idea, this collar running all the way from here to about here in the cockpit, surrounding the cockpit rim, which of course is very hard. It's part of the monocoque structure and not something you'd want to be running into in an accident. So you've got all of that. Also topside, moving out across the flanks of the car, here are those chimneys that we talked about. So chimney exhausting through here, and then this little flick up here just rears of the chimney. Again, trying to manipulate that flow as we pass over the flick up ahead of the rear wheel, and of course to the rear wing as we see here. Very, very nice. Rear wing, not all that much different really from what we see today, but the main plane is just straight across for the most part, rather than the highly sculpted main plane leading edges that we see today. Rear zone, the diffuser will be behind the rear axle here from our vantage point, but the reference plane going all the way across here, and it starts to go inboard there with the sculpting of the side pod as well, just trying to feed the top end of the diffuser. All this empty space here that they have to play with, they have even more of that now, and this area of the car has been very much concentrated on in terms of the modern regulations, particularly for 2021, trying to cut down some of the louvers and holes in the floor that they were using to generate more vortices to seal the diffuser through the reference plane relative to the bottom of the car and the road surface there. But again, still using the same sorts of techniques here all the way back in 2005. Very cool. Also, just want to point out the tire and wheel assemblies here. Looks very nice here with the detail available. Do like all of that. Very, very cool. Just plastic wheels here, but rubber tires, and it all looks good. And I do like the speckle finish that you get in the paint. It's just sort of making everything look metallic, as it well should, these being magnesium wheels. Very, very cool. I do like all of that. Nice sidewall lettering as well, Bridgestone Potenza visible. I do like all of that. It's very, very cool. It all looks the part, and again, perhaps some of the detail on here a little bit lacking relative to what we've seen from other model manufacturers, but for what we've got here, for the age of this model, it's very nice. Taking a look at the rear zone here on F2005, zooming in. There we go. There's our first real look at the diffuser, and you can see that it's knocked down quite a lot. If you've seen the diffuser on the F2004, yeah, a lot of the curved straight sections, they are gone. They've all been chopped away in an attempt to cut some of the downforce that these guys were generating in this era. The diffusers were also knocked down for 2005. Probably not as much as the front wings were, relatively speaking, but still they were, and it did have an effect on overall downforce generation. But we can see here that we still do have a substantial diffuser structure, and of course all that goes a long way in generating a lot of the car's downforce, particularly here at the rear, very important for overall stability of the platform. You can see that we have got basically two levels of diffuser, and of course the central tunnel there where the starter hole is as well, very important, probably the most important part of the overall downforce generation here, that basically that's the only semblance of a tunnel that Formula One diffusers had, and still to some extent have today. So very interesting to see all of that modeled nicely enough, perhaps not as detailed as it could be, but again, remembering the age of the model, pretty good, and it's very indicative of what we had from Mattel in this era. Zooming in a little bit, there's the rear crash structure and the rain light, just with a clear lens on it, no red filters or anything, but it is there and it looks good. The rear wing main plane there, you can see the slot gap between the two sections of flap there. That looks good with the little central stay, and we do have as well that little T-wing head of the rear wing in black there across the car laterally, looking good. Additionally, there are our exhaust outlets. That all looks nice. The periscope style exhaust that Ferrari pioneered back in '98, still using it today, and they were the main purveyors of the wonderful noise that the V10 engines used to give us. Very cool. On the rear wing proper, you can see that we do have a lower beam wing on this one. The exhaust would be blowing the beam wing to some extent. The exhaust also blowing the rear suspension, the upper wishbones, which of course would have been shrouded with aerodynamically shaped fairings to try and generate a little bit more downforce, but really just to try and minimize on the drag that you'd be getting in that era. Zoomed into the diffuser, you can see more of the detail in that now. All looks the part, looks good. You can see our rear axle in there, in between the lower wishbones. Very cool. And of course the central tunnel of the diffuser there with its own little fin work there at the rear of the legality plank at the bottom of the car. Looking very nice. I do like all of that immensely. And of course our rear tire detail looks good, notwithstanding. Very, very cool. Very much a fan of the overall configurations, aerodynamically as well as just aesthetically, of the Formula One cars in this era. They looked marvelous. And from the left side of the car, very much a mirror image of what we have on the right side, as we saw earlier. But just showing it for continuity's sake, same sorts of details visible here on the left as we saw on the right. Very cool. There are your barge boards again, and then everything that we pointed out on the left is here just in mirror image profile, with the exception of the wheel nuts. So just do want to point that out. If you remember, on the right side of the car, we had ourselves blue wheel nuts here, and obviously here on the left they are red. Why is this? Well, basically it just indicates the direction of the threads. So in other words, the threads, the nuts and threads on the stub axles, they will tighten in an opposite direction relative to what side of the car you're working on. So the wheel nuts just painted blue and red to be a quick reference to the mechanics. Which direction do these threads run? Very, very cool to see all of that. I'm not entirely sure why they do that. I do believe that some of the teams anyway still do this today. I'm not quite sure why they do it, but they did do it, and that's the reason for the different colored wheel nuts on each side here on the Ferrari. So very cool. I do like all of that. Obviously, we've got good sponsorship details. Some little bits of paint loss and decal loss along some of the shut lines visible here, but they still look pretty good, and they're not all that apparent by eye. The camera magnifying this image quite substantially, so they're more apparent now. Also, a little bit of sloppy shut line here, that panel gap between the lower side of the side pod and the covers here, which would be removable on the real car, not removable here, but obviously separate pieces that were assembled for the manufacturer of this model, and you can see some of the shut lines there. Perhaps it's a little bit dirty, but at the same time, what can you really expect? It's good enough for me, and doesn't really impact the visual presence of this car, in my opinion. Otherwise, the decals and logos everywhere else, they look good. The main Vodafone branding here that Ferraris ran in this era, in addition to your contingency sponsors there down below. I do like all of that. Looks very good. Yeah. Just good. It's really just a solid mid-2000s Grand Prix car. I like it a lot, and, well, it is what it is. Do they make them better nowadays? Yep, they do. Does Mattel make them better nowadays? Yeah, I would say probably. Haven't gotten a Mattel model in a while, but just the technology in terms of the tooling has moved on, and the more resources that they've got now. I mean, go on the internet and you can find any picture you want of basically anything. So if they want to do research on how to make these things look a little bit more authentic, definitely easier now. But this is what you got in the mid-2000s, and you know, even some of the limitations notwithstanding, it looks good enough in my book. Going freehand now to take some closer looks at some of the finer details on this one. There's our front wing, seen slightly now from above, so you can get a better sense of what everything looks like. Nice decal work on it, and decent paint work as well. Generally speaking, on some of these models, you start to get some flaking across the leading and trailing edges of these wings, just because everything is so thin, but not so much here. Very little bits you can see just on the extreme trailing edge of the upper flap. But really, it looks very, very nice. Same goes for the little gantry wing here. Looks good enough to me. Very nice, and even a little Bridgestone decal there visible. A little bit of paint loss there on the leading edges of the end plates, both on the big gantry wing as well as on the principal front wing. But again, not too bad, nothing really to write home about, so looks good enough. There's that nose tip, though. Looks very good. I do like all of that. Marvelous. There's the number one. This is the last Formula One car driven by Michael Schumacher to feature the number one on it, as he was no longer the reigning champion at the end of 2005. There's our front suspension arrangement there. You can see the carbon look there on the elements of the suspension. You can see the same on the rear later on, but looks good. I like all of that. That was one little detail that I liked on these Mattel cars. The Mini Champs cars also do this, but I feel like the carbon weave is just a little bit too big on those to look really authentic. This one, it's much tighter and smaller, so I think it looks better all along. There we go, the front section of the monocoque, the radiator inlets, you can see that matrix there perhaps a little bit more clearly. I do like all of that, and of course the top side with our antenna work, that all looks nice. And there we go into the cockpit, Michael Schumacher there visible. The seat belts, they're just decals, they're not actually fabric belts, but they are there. I appreciate the attempt at modeling it. And of course the logo's there on the driver's suit, and on the helmet looks good. Michael Schumacher's bright orange helmet, his trademark. Yep, color looks about right. It's not quite the same color as the car, so it helped him stand out a little bit on TV. I like all of that. In particular, I used to like the onboard shots that we got looking into the cockpit from about this angle, but closer in. I just liked the way that his helmet used to pop on TV. I liked all of that. There's our roll bar and intake snorkel for the engine, and on the sides of the roll bar, if the focus will calm down, you can see that they have got the little laurel wreath there that Ferrari puts on all of their cars the year after they win a Constructors' Championship. So that wreath there would be commemorating their win in the 2004 Constructors' Championship. Looks good. I do like all of that. Rear section, you can see the exhaust outlets there, looking good. And our rear suspension, look at all of the heat witness stickers that we have got on the wishbones and on the push rods at the rear. Of course, all of this would be in the vicinity of some very hot air. You've got the exhaust there, and of course you've got the air coming out of the engine bay, so all very hot, and carbon, of course, not a greatly heat-tolerant material, so they're going to want to make sure they get a sense of what the peak temperatures are there if they're going to be outside of design limits. Rear wing, there we go, the main plane face of the rear wing with the slot gap visible. I do like all of that, looks good. And the leading edge there painted red just because, well, you know, Ferrari. The T-wing there, head of the rear wing, looking good. Also done with that carbon look, as well as the beam wing on the rear wing, looking nice. Do like all of that a lot. Just, again, I loved the detailing of these cars in this era. It just was, it looked like something that goes fast to me. Again, the more modern ones, yeah, some of them look good, some of them perhaps don't look so good, but this was the design language that I really gravitated toward back in this day, and still is the design language that I gravitate toward. This is what a Formula One car looks like when I think of a Formula One car. Taking a look into the cockpit, this is probably where you see some of the biggest differences between some of the more modern models and ones like this, which are now 15, 16 years old. There is a cockpit modeled, quite obviously. There's a steering wheel in it, and it is generally the right size and shape, but the amount of detail on it is very much lacking. You can see that they've attempted some buttons here, but all they've done is just throw some paint on the different raised sections of the steering wheel and try to emulate buttons. There is no attempt at rendering the screen, which would have been on the steering wheel, not nearly as big as the screens that are now on the steering wheels, but the screen nonetheless. But what they have put here, it's okay. You can see the rather large AMD branding there just below the windscreen, which looks a little bit too thick to be scale correct, but it is there nonetheless. And, it's not half bad, all things considered. Looking in to where the driver is, Seatbelt detail visible. Again, just a decal, but it's there. And some steering column detail as well. And you do have some raised sections on the steering wheel to show an attempt at paddles. But, you know, nothing really great in there. But still, it is there, and they gave it an honest effort at very least. Also, though, the steering does work on this model. So there you go. It does bind a little bit, just getting past center, but it is there, so, you know, I can't complain all that much about it. Of course, there we go, the cockpit collar there, the padding surround, Schumacher, Michael Schumacher's name there. A red roll bar to signify car number 1 on a given team. These wings just rears of the roll hoop. And of course the rear of the engine cover. And our engine exhaust for the right bank. Inset very far, really, I must say. The pipe is right at the termination of the carbon bodywork, and then you've got this ramp that the exhaust will entrain itself to. Again, trying to exploit a little bit of Quanta effect there, I would suspect. Just trying to get that high pressure flow to attach itself to the adjacent surface and then blow through the rear wing there at the back. So, you know, it's not the most sophisticated design that we have seen, but it's there and it worked in the day, and that's what it looked like. So a very fair effort there by Mattel. Just generally quite pleased with what this car is as a model, and it has aged very nicely, I must say. It's still one of the favorites in the collection, and that's why I wanted to take another look at it. So there it was, in 1/18th scale by Mattel Hot Wheels, the Ferrari F2005. Is it the most interesting car in the world? No. Is it the most well-known because it had the most success? Absolutely not. But to me, I really like it, and, well, I liked it enough that I have had it in the collection for several years. I guess probably close to about 8-9 years now. Remember, I bought this one, I want to say I bought it in 2012 or 2013. I definitely got a good deal on eBay back in those days, but I like it. Can you still find these models? Yeah, they're still around, although because they only make these in limited quantities, and in this era they only made them basically in the year that they competed or immediately following the end of the season. So again, I would say a 2005, early 2006 production date for this particular model. But for what they are, I think they're very good representations of Formula One cars. And of course, things have changed a lot. You have more manufacturers on the scene now. You've got Auto Art who have really taken off. Mini Champs, of course, always did a good job on Formula One cars, and they still do. But they didn't have that Ferrari license in this era. So I've got to say, this was the only F2005 model that you could get in 1/18th scale in the era, and it definitely wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination. Could a re-release of a model like this do well nowadays? Yeah, I would say they'd probably be better served to re-release an F2004, but yeah, definitely it's a good one, and it being the only example of the F2005 you can have, it's definitely good enough. Would I like some better detail? Sure. Would I like it to have removable bodywork? Absolutely I would. That's really a rarity on Formula One models, particularly ones of this era. But for what it is, plenty good enough, and I'm quite pleased still to have it in the collection. And if you're in the market for one of these, if you can find one in good condition, yeah, it is what it is. It's not bad at all. And of course, it's got the provenance of being a red Ferrari with the number 1 on it with Michael Schumacher in the cockpit. So, although it's only got one Grand Prix victory to its credit, and that victory was against, 5 other cars, one of which was the other Ferrari, well, that is what it is. But it's a little bit of a historical Easter egg because of the circumstances in which it won that race. And of course, having Michael Schumacher's name attached to it does not hurt it in the least. So, yeah, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this one. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.